Hello everybody, this is a mini lecture online about creating reading guides and comprehension constructors, which is the next lesson plan you're going to be writing for this course. I'm using a new program called Docere to make this presentation, so if there's awkward pauses, it's just because I'm still trying to figure out how to use this. So here we go. We've spent much time in this class talking about how content literacy needs to be about scaffolding reading as an active process. So active that students should actually have to fasten helmets while they read. And we're going to talk about today one way to scaffold reading as an active process is to create what some people call reading guides, or as our friend Tavani calls them, comprehension constructors. So when you read the Tavani chapter, she called these comprehension constructors, and I'll put a heart around Tavani because of how much we really loved reading her texts. All right, so you're invited to construct a comprehension constructor, and they're also called reading guides. And I've put directions for this assignment up on my DU, but there's a few things I wanted to say to you as you begin creating your reading guide or comprehension constructor. First of all, I want you to think really carefully about what you learned from the Conley article where he compared Miss Gunning's classroom with Vignette 1 and Vignette 2, and he showed how in Vignette 1, the teacher seemed to use a graphic organizer more as a worksheet, where it was kind of rigid, students just took information and filled in the blanks based on what the teacher said. There wasn't a lot of critical and creative and strategic thinking that went along with that. So what we're focusing on when we're creating our reading guide is that it is a cognitive tool. And this means that it involves flexible thinking. So in Vignette 2 of Miss Gunning's classroom in the Conley text that you read, the students had to think about which circles they were putting information in, how they were putting information together, why they were putting it down. They could add circles as they needed, move things around. So it was a more flexible tool that focused around students thinking about the content information in the text. And you should have noticed while you were reading this that it was much more student-centered and collaborative, and of course, strategic and cognitive. The other thing that should be really clear when you're creating your comprehension guide is that students have the opportunity to name their thinking and make it visible. So this connects back to what we've talked about, where students should be stopping and thinking and reacting while they're reading or viewing or listening to a text, and they should be really making their thinking visible so they're very aware of what they're doing as strategic and active readers to construct meaning. And of course, when we're scaffolding active engagement with text, we're really thinking about how we're helping students construct meaning before, during, and after reading. And of course, reading can be viewing, watching, listening. But before reading, we're making sure that students are thinking about accessing their background knowledge and building on key information that they might need. During reading, we're again asking students to stop and think and react. And after reading, we want students to reflect upon how their thinking has changed since they've engaged with this text, and also to reflect on the work that they did as readers, to think about the strategies they used or could have used or would even use again in the future. So ultimately, we want our comprehension guide or our reading guide or comprehension constructor to guide readers to construct meaning of a text, to learn content information. So we're going to look at an example that I made for my students when I taught middle school. Now keep in mind that I made this in my first few years teaching, and if I had it to use again, I would make some revisions based on things that I've learned about reading since this point. And I want you to notice that this reading guide that I made was actually a viewing guide. Students watched a movie while I was away at a conference, and I used this guide for them to guide active and strategic viewing of this movie, and this was part of a social studies class. So I started off with some pre-reading or previewing work where I had students access what they knew from social studies about the First Amendment and what they believed about the First Amendment. After that, I included in the guide then information about the video that they were going to be watching, and this also served to establish a purpose. So down here I helped students connect to themes that we had already talked about in social studies and to keep those in mind. So I wanted them to think carefully about something while they were watching this movie, and also to keep important goals in mind while they were watching this movie. So that again is part of establishing a purpose that we've talked about several times throughout this course. The next part of the reading guide is the during viewing. Hold on just a second. I have to go back. All right. So the during viewing, I want you to notice that I had students specifically use 3 type of strategies to better comprehend this text. So I had them make connections, ask questions, and identify most important points. And we had already done a lot of these strategies in my social studies and reading class, and I had modeled for them and explained them. And so the students would stop and think and react while viewing the movie using all 3 of these strategies. And this is a part, if you're using a reading guide, where as a teacher you could actually model maybe for the first few minutes of a movie or for the first few pages of a book or for the beginning part of an article, you yourself could model how you would fill out part of this graphic organizer, and then maybe let them take over and fill out the rest of the graphic organizer with a buddy or even independently if that fit your purposes. And finally, for the post viewing, I had students focus on the question of so what? So what does this information matter to you? If I had this to do again, I would add a bit more of why they're thinking what they're thinking and have students explain their thinking a little more. Here's what I think and here's why I think it. And also notice that I had students reflect upon their reading strategies. So I wanted to think specifically, what did they do as a reader today? But again, if I had this to do again, I would have them explain more about how did they use these strategies and how were these strategies helpful, how could they have been more helpful, or even what they would do as readers in the future. I want you to know, and I did email this to you, that there are other examples of reading guides posted on MyDU, so you can see how other educators have worked to guide students to construct meaning of text before, during, and after reading. So when you go to construct your own comprehension constructor or reading guide, here's some questions that you can ask yourself to think about while you're putting this lesson together. And choose a really interesting text and find creative ways to guide students to really actively and strategically engage with this text. Good luck and have fun.